Hello, welcome. This is Ron Allen saying to you in the Greek language, Kalimera, the greeting people would have had for one another in the world of the first century, the world of Jesus. This is the third in a series of short, hopefully inspirational studies of the Gospel of Mark during this period of staying at home. The series is entitled The Gospel of Mark, Emergency Literature, because I join a number of scholars in thinking that the Gospel of Mark was written about the year 70, when Judaism and the followers of Jesus were in an emergency situation caused by the Romans having besieged Jerusalem, sacked the city, destroyed the temple, and with it, most of the economy, the religious rights, many of the social structures of Judaism. The question for the followers of Jesus is, who are we? What shall we do? What hope can we have in the midst of this world when so many things we have counted on are now counted out? So the first session, I spoke briefly about the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark and the idea that Mark is telling the story of Jesus in order to give the community living in that emergency situation a sense of hope. Last time, we looked briefly at John the Baptist and his message of repentance, which for the time in which we are living, I took to be an openness to a future which contains more possibility for blessing than we have imagined, even more possibility than we knew before the emergency began. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, we have talked about Jesus, but he has not appeared until tonight when we discuss the immersion of Jesus. Although this act is sometimes called the baptism of Jesus, the word baptizo in Greek meant to dip, to plunge, to cover entirely, or to immerse. And the act contains within it the symbolism of the self going down into the water, being washed clean, the old self drowning, and a renewed self coming up out of the water, cleansed and walking toward a new and better future. Immersion was already practiced in Judaism as a part of the purification rite for going to the temple. The act of immersion recalls Genesis 1, the creation of the world out of the waters, and most especially out at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, a community that was on the edge of the Dead Sea. When people came out to join that community, they came out and were immersed as a way of saying goodbye to the world they had known and living in anticipation of the world that was coming. And that's the context in which we hear Mark tell in just verses the story that begins, in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth and was immersed by John in the river Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heaven torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven saying, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." So by going out to John in the Jordan, Jesus identifies himself as one with those who want to turn away from the old, to give up the life as they had known it, so characterized by idolatry, violence, exploitation, injustice, manipulation, and finally death, and turn toward a world in which all persons and situations were shaped by God's love, by the desire for peace, justice, mutuality, sharing, abundance for all, and life in all its dimensions. He goes out, and you can imagine a group of people standing alongside the River Jordan. John is in the middle of the river, and as people come out to John, he takes them in his arms, just as the minister does at West Street when a candidate for baptism comes into the baptismal pool, and plunges them down into the water and raises them up. It is entirely significant that the candidate puts himself or herself in the hands of the prophet or the minister, because, as Alexander Campbell, one of the founders of our Christian church, Disciples of Christ, said, in baptism, in immersion, we are passive in everything except giving our consent. God is the actor in baptism. And as Jesus is coming up out of the water, the heavens rip open. The word in Greek is schizomenoi, from which you immediately recognize our English word schizophrenic. Just as a person who is suffering from schizophrenia is violently separated into parts, so people at the time of Mark believed that when the heavens ripped open, God would come down and begin the actual process of transformation from the old to the new. So this one word is Mark's way of saying this process is already beginning, coming to nascent expression in the world through the ministry of Jesus. And the Spirit comes down like a dove on him. And in those days, they believed that during the great season of transition from the old to the new, God would send a special portion of the Spirit to empower God's witnesses to stand up in the face of conflict and stand for the values of love, peace, justice, living together in mutuality, abundance, and life. This is Mark's way of saying this Spirit is come to life in Jesus and has the power of God working through him. And as the Spirit comes down, we hear a voice from heaven. Now, the rabbis had an interesting idea about the voice of God. Some of them believed that it was too much for the human ear. It would overwhelm, overpower in the most damaging sense. And so God would speak in the daughter of a voice, that is, in a voice that was present and powerful, but adapted to what the human sensorium could receive. And the voice says, "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." This quote comes not only from God, but from Psalm 2:7. This psalm was used in the life of Israel on a special occasion, when there was a transition in the monarchy, when the prince was elevated to the throne. This psalm was spoken, and God would say, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." The prince has been in preparation, but only when adopted fully and finally by God does the full identity of the prince come into operation. This is Mark's way of saying Jesus is now coming into his own as the dynamic agent of transformation. And we focus often on "you are my son" with reference to the identity of Jesus. And to be sure, that is present. But in the ancient context, it's important to remember they believed that the monarch, the ruler, the king, embodied God's value, was supposed to embody God's values and practices, and see that they were enacted in all the community. "You are my son" is not just a reference about his person, it is also a way of speaking about his larger mission. And scholars make an interesting point that pertains to the world of Mark, and that pertains also very much to us in our situation of emergency. Scholars conclude that the immersion of Jesus is the model, the example, the paradigm for the model of those who follow Jesus. That we too are immersed into the life of Jesus then, and given the power represented by the Spirit enacted in Jesus to witness in later times and places to God's desire for the possibilities of a transformed world. And in the days of Mark, you would think, with the world collapsing around you, you would just pull in. But this narrative is a reminder that those who have been immersed in Jesus have indeed received identity, that God has promised to be with and to work through us in the same way that God did through Jesus. And we have a mission, which is to continue the transforming witness of Jesus, even in the circumstances of emergency. This seems to me such a contemporary word. When so many things we have counted on are now counted out, we do need to be reminded that God has said to each one of us, "You are my son, you are my daughter." And while we may be tempted, especially because we are staying at home, while we may be tempted to circle the wagons, the situation of emergency is precisely the time when God gives us the Spirit to witness to the great transformation that God has in mind for all.